Hey everyone, and welcome to OPG Live, your source for all things related to outdoor photography. I am professional photographer Ian Plant.
And I'm Leah Zahner.
We are also here to entertain you and to tell you many photography-related jokes, which is why Leah keeps on laughing.
Of course, I've started early already.
She's contractually obligated to laugh at my jokes. Thank you very much. So today we're going to talk about how you can use moving water creatively in your outdoor photographs. But before that, I'm sure that Leah has a few important announcements. Leah, take it away.
Very important announcements. As usual, our OPG Live Q&A is sponsored by Tamron today. But I also have a pretty good announcement here of something that you can pick up on your own time. It is 7 ways to immediately improve your photography. It is a free digital download just for you. It's by photographer David Johnston. It covers construction, composition techniques, your gear, and even the weather. And you can download it for free right now by clicking the banner underneath the video or the link in the description if you're watching on Facebook. With that, I think we're ready to dive into some photos.
Well, that sounds great, but I have only one question to ask.
Yes.
After spending an hour with me, why would anyone want to learn from anyone else?
Good question, but you might need it to compare.
True. Yeah, you know, the only way to know how good it is you've got it during these live events is to try learning from someone else. Well, so I'm going to dive right in, all jokes aside. Actually, David Johnston is a great photographer, and he's got lots of great insights, so I definitely recommend that you download his book. But in the meantime, we're going to talk about how you can use moving water creatively in your photographs. And I thought that being winter and all, this is a good time to be talking about moving water because there's so much of it out there right now. Like, yeah, no, everything's frozen. Obviously, this is something that will come in handy in a few months when everything unfreezes. But of course, not everyone who's watching this is living in a super cold place like I do here in Minneapolis. Many of you are coming from different places around the world or in the southern U.S. where things are warmer and you do have some unfrozen water available to you. So I'm hoping that the tips that I offer today will help you make more creative moving water photographs. So the key to making successful moving water photographs is to use a long exposure. If you use a short exposure with moving water, you know, like 1/50th or 1/60th of a second or something shorter, that is going to freeze the water, and the water is not going to really look the way it looks to the eye. It's going to look instead like ice. It's going to be static, and it's going to be very staccato. So like, you know, if you think of a stream, like a babbling brook, if you freeze the action of all that water, you're going to have literally thousands of these little points of frozen water that are going to be very distracting for the viewer, and I don't think are going to make a very attractive photograph. Like there's a very small but vocal contingent of photographers out there that believe the only way to render water realistically is to use a really short exposure and to freeze the action of the water. And I'm always interested when I see these people in action, because I think that they're very much wrong. I mean, to each their own, but I don't think the photographs look particularly good. And I also don't think that the photographs look the way the human eye perceives water. So obviously, we don't see things moment to moment the way a camera does. So a camera will capture and freeze a moment. So when you're looking at water flowing in a stream or on the shore, you're seeing it moving, but you know, you're not really seeing it you know, flowing like you might have it rendered in a long exposure. It's more like the way a video camera would see the water moving, but you do perceive that movement. So if you freeze the action of the water, I don't think it's going to look very good in the final photograph. It's also not going to be very realistic to the eyes. Now, if you have too long of an exposure and you completely blur the water out, that also doesn't look the way that the eye perceives it. So if you're aiming to get a look for the water that's kind of similar to the way the eye sees it, you're going to want to have some motion blur in the water, but you're going to want to mix in a little bit of texture. You don't want to completely blur the water out. And that probably the most closely approximates the way the human eye, the human brain perceives moving water. But that said, you don't always have to make a photograph look the way the eye would see it. You can use long exposures creatively to challenge perceptions and to give the moving water an artistic look. So I'm going to stop talking about this in the abstract, and we're going to dive right in to, I've been told, many moving water photos that I have submitted for this live event. So I'm going to go through as quickly as possible. As always, if you have questions about the photos or the techniques that I'm talking about, just go ahead and send them in, and Leah will interrupt and read those questions off. If you've got more general questions, we will save that for the second half of this Q&A event when I will actually dive in to the Q and the A. Emphasis on the A. Lots of answers here. So remember, the best chance you have of getting your question read live is to make sure that it's a good question or a funny question or better, both. Okay, so let's dive right in.
Let's start with one right
Okay,
off
we
the
got
bat.
one right off the bat.
Something to keep in mind as we go through the photos. Pedro has asked, I'm happy you're discussing the topic of water-based photography. I struggle with taking photos of waterfalls, have a hard time avoiding this silky look. I would like a clearer shot, so any tips would be appreciated.
Okay, so Pedro is trying to avoid the silky look, and I'm going to be recommending that you embrace that silky smoothness. But that said, you know, as I said earlier, you don't necessarily want to go completely silky smooth. You want to keep some texture in the water. If you freeze the action of the water, there's going to be too much texture. It's not going to look that good. So you want to have a mix of some texture with some silky smooth. So the key thing is selecting a shutter speed that is going to give you that proper mix. And there's no one silver bullet. There's no one shutter speed that's going to be right, because the shutter speeds that you use will depend on how much water is flowing, how fast it's flowing, the look that you want for your photo. But my kind of general rule of thumb that I use when I'm out making photos, I start with a half-second exposure, and then I experiment there. If there's a lot of water and it's moving very fast, I might do something shorter, like 1/4 of a second or 1/8 of a second. If there's not a lot of water, then I might slow things down and do a longer exposure of 1 second, 4 seconds, 8 seconds, 30 seconds, whatever. The end result should be what you want, and you pick a shutter speed that's going to give you that result. But let me show you a few examples. And one thing that's really critical here, just in case it goes without saying, I'm going to say it anyways. If you're doing long exposure photography, you need your camera on a tripod. So your camera has to be stable so that you get a sharp image. The longer exposure, anything that's moving like water, will blur that element, and that's how you're going to get that silky smooth effect. So once again, let us dive right in, and I'm going to keep Pedro's point in mind, and we're going to talk about how to achieve that optimum balance between silky smooth and keeping some texture in the flowing water. Okay, so for this first photo, there it is. Now this is a photo I made off the coast of Costa Rica many years ago, and this is, I think, an example of what I'm trying to do artistically with moving water, and we'll also talk about the technical side of things, how I achieve the look. So for this particular photo, I had a few things going on. There was this one cloud in the sky that was catching that last light of sunset, and it's got a bit of a curving shape. And I'm going to go into the markup tool here so that I can show you guys some of these things that I'm talking about. So, you know, we've got that cloud here with that curving shape. And what I wanted to do was to find a way to mirror that shape with the water. So I chose a long exposure of the water flowing out around this boulder that was exposed by the low tide. And that allowed me to complement the shape that is in the sky. So I'm using the flowing water to help create a foreground shape that works with, complements or mirrors other shapes that I have in the scene. Now, that's what I was trying to achieve artistically. In terms of the technicals, a shot like this with water flowing out, as I said, typically about a half second or maybe 1 second will give you that look. So you can see in this water, there is that silky smooth look, but I still have some texture. The key thing here is I wanted the water to create a shape. I wanted that specific shape that would mirror the shape of the cloud in the sky. So I wanted to make sure that I had a shutter speed that would achieve that shape. So if I didn't use the long exposure, the water would not have created that curving shape as it was flowing out around the boulder. But by having that long exposure, that shape is created during the long exposure. And if I had gone for a longer exposure, let's say I'd done 30 seconds, there would have been no shape at all, because all I would have had was multiple waves coming in and out that would have been cumulatively recorded by the camera, and that shape would have disappeared. So I chose a shutter speed to get the shape that I wanted. So I've got a little bit of that silky smoothness, but I still have texture and I still have shape. I still have definition in the water flowing out. And this is what I think, Pedro and everyone else, you should be aiming for when you make shots like this. This, hold on a second, let me go out of the markup here, and we'll go to the next photo. And here's another example of how you can creatively use the shapes created by flowing water as a foreground in a landscape composition. So this was a stream, and I got into the stream, so I was wearing a pair of chest waders, the kind that fly fishermen wear, so I could get into the water and keep dry and keep warm. And I was probably in up to my waist. And you want to make sure you've got good footwear, and you're very, very careful because sometimes rocks will be slippery on the bottom of the stream bed. So you want to make sure you're not like swept downstream by the water. So you want to be very cautious. But I got into the water, and the water was flowing around me. And there was a lot of foam in the water because there was a waterfall above me. So instead of taking a picture of the waterfall, I looked downstream because I saw this really interesting S-curve shape that was formed by the flowing water. Now, once again, if I had not done a long exposure, then the shape that was created by this flowing stream wouldn't have been apparent. So that shorter exposure would have made all of that flowing water look staccato, and that S-curve would have disappeared. So it was really critical to choose a shutter speed that would show that shape. And with this particular shot, I think my shutter speed was 4 seconds long because I wanted to have a lot of that streaking foam coming through the foreground area, creating these lines. So I needed enough of that foam to create all these lines in the foreground. And because the foam wasn't there wasn't a huge volume of foam, it took 4 seconds to fill in that space with those lines. So as I said, the shutter speed you choose is going to depend on how fast the water's flowing, how much water is flowing, and the shapes that you're trying to create. So here, 4 seconds was perfect. For another shot, 4 seconds would not be any good. So let me go ahead and just discard these changes and, whoops, edit. Let me see. Hold on. Oh, whatever, it's just going to keep them. That's okay, we'll move on. So here's a shot that I took along the coast of Iceland. And once again, I wanted to create a shape. I wanted to create an interesting foreground. I had these dark black rocks in my foreground that weren't that interesting. I had this one cloud that was in the scene here in the sky and had a nice little curvy shape. So I wanted a foreground shape that would complement that. So these black rocks weren't very interesting as a foreground. So I waited for a wave to come in and fill in the space. And I took a lot of different shots as waves came in, and I experimented with my shutter speed. Once again, we're looking at something like about 1 second here. And that's how long it took for the water to come in and spread through this depression in the rocks and fill in that space and create that shape. Now, with all of these shots I've shown you so far, this has been water flowing out. Like on the coast, it's been a wave coming in, and then I wait till the wave starts going out before I trigger the shutter. For that stream shot, that was water flowing downstream. I don't always shoot these shots with the water flowing away from me, but it can give you some really interesting shapes. So you'll get a different look when the water's coming towards you, and I'll show you a few images of that. So it's not entirely critical that you have the water flowing away from you. I just find that I often prefer that look instead of having the water come towards me. So once again, I picked my shutter speed to give me the shape that I wanted to fill that foreground space in the right way. So let me see here, we're done with that. Move on to the next photo. Here's another example of using an incoming wave to create a foreground in a landscape shot. So once again, I had some black rocks. This was down in Torres del Paine National Park in Chile. And the black rocks in my foreground were not that interesting. They didn't have a lot of color or texture. They didn't make a very good foreground. So I waited for some waves to come in, and I wanted a wave that would complement the shape of that storm cloud, that really dramatic storm cloud above the mountains. So I took lots and lots of shots, and these were big waves that were crashing in. I experimented with shooting when the wave was coming in and when the wave was flowing back out. This particular shot was when the wave was flowing back out. Once again, I was starting off with about a half-second exposure, kind of experimenting around 1/2 second. So I think this particular shot was 1/2 a second or 1 second. Those are pretty close to each other. And once again, I was choosing that shutter speed to create a shape. And in this case, the shape is complementing the cloud in the sky. So as we move to the markup tool, I think I'll use red this time. We've got, oops, that did not work. Hold on a second. All right, red. So we've got this curving shape of the cloud, and the curve is mirrored by the wave coming in the foreground. So these actually work together to create this overall S-curve shape that gets the viewer's eye moving from the lower left of the composition to the upper right and zigging and zagging back and forth, getting the viewer to hit all the important parts of the composition. So this is what I'm aiming for when I am doing these coastal scenes or these moving water scenes, looking to create a shape by picking the proper shutter speed to give me the shape that I want. So this is a waterfall in Iceland, and here I used the stream itself as the foreground, looking into the small waterfall in the background, and then I've got the sunset sky above it. And for this particular shot, once again, we're looking at about half-second or 1-second exposure. When you've got smaller cascades, like I do here in the foreground, you can get away with longer exposures and still get a lot of texture. So this probably would have looked very similar at 4 seconds as it did at 1 second or at 2 seconds. So with the smaller cascades, it's not as critical. With more bigger masses of water, picking the correct shutter speed to get the look you want is very critical. So here, all these little cascades, it was the same volume of water going over them. So I knew that pretty much no matter what my shutter speed was, as long as it was long enough to blur the water, I would end up getting that same look in the water. But in other areas of the scene, the flow coming through here, there was more water, a higher volume of water. So I wanted to make sure that I didn't end up with this featureless mass of white. So I didn't take a very long exposure. Instead of going for 30 seconds, I went for something more like a half-second or 1 second, so that I still had some texture in those background areas there, so I didn't lose the texture there. So trying to find that mix of blur and texture is very critical. Now, I find that these sorts of shots, whether it's a waterfall or a coastal scene, they work best when you've got something for the water to flow around. So I'm often looking for a big boulder or a log or something like that sticking out of the water. Like here, for example, there was just 1 or 2 big boulders that were sticking out of the water. And I would use that as my foreground with the waterfall or the mountain scene or whatever in the background. And I would pick a foreground where the water's flowing around that feature on both sides to help create a more dynamic composition. So the boulder itself in this particular shot ends up being a visual anchor that is where the viewer starts their journey, and it is juxtaposed against the waterfall in the background. So that's going to get the eye kind of moving back and forth between those two visual elements, which I think is very important. It helps create a dynamic composition. And then all of the moving water on the left and the right creates a bunch of converging diagonal lines and curves that help bring the eye in from the edges and corners of the image into that central part of the composition where the waterfall is. So, using these shapes created by the water to create these dynamic and compelling compositions is what you're after here. That is the end game, and you should be choosing your shutter speed and your composition accordingly. So here's another shot. If you remember from earlier on, let me just kind of flip back. This shot here, when I turned around to face the waterfall, this is the exact same spot, and that's the view looking upstream. And for this particular shot, I had no foreground. There was no boulders sticking out of the water. I just had the water flowing past me. And you can see that there are some of these foam streaks in the water, so you can see that they create all these interesting shapes. And so what I needed to do was to use the moving water itself as my foreground. So once again, selecting a shutter speed to try to create a shape that's going to be interesting and help lead the eye deeper into the scene. So, as per usual, started off at about a half second, maybe experiment with 1 second or a quarter second. A shot like this, I might take 30 or 40 or 50 different images. I'm just experimenting because every time the water moves a little bit differently and every time you get a different shape. For this particular shot, I got this nice curving shape here in the foreground, and that was the best shape of all the shots that I got. It was a nice curve, an S-curve to help lead the viewer deeper into the scene and get the viewer meandering from left to right as they move from foreground to background. So once again, paying close attention, experimenting with the shutter speed to get that texture in the water, to get that right mix between blur and texture, and just doing a lot of different shots until I get the shape that I want. And this is a coastal scene from Olympic National Park on the Pacific Ocean. And I had selected my overall composition, which was an arrangement of these sea stacks. So I selected a position that had the sea stacks moving from left to right so that they weren't overlapping or bunched up. They had some visual separation. And then I just needed the water to come in to fill the space. And of course, when you're working in a tidal environment, you can't always have the water exactly where you want it to be. So sometimes you have to wait for the tide to advance or to retreat until it's coming in just right for your chosen composition. So the sun was setting, the tide was coming in. So I waited for the moment when the tide crept up enough that as the waves came in, like the bigger waves would come in and they would wash around these giant rocks and sea stacks. So like, for example, that one stack on the right, just to give you a sense of scale, it's probably like 50 or 60 feet tall. And the stack in the background is about the same size, but because it's farther away, it looks smaller in the composition. So I had to wait for the waves to come in, like a big wave, to go around the rock and to fill in that space in the foreground with some interesting shapes. So once again, we see some curving shapes that help lead the eye from foreground to background. Now, when you're working in moving water, especially when it's waves, where you have waves coming in and out, like if you're in a water, like if you're standing in a stream and you got your tripod set up in a stream, the water flow is pretty constant, so you can get it set up. But every time you've got a wave coming in, if one wave is a little bit bigger than another wave, it can move and knock your tripod around. So what I do is I very gently push my tripod legs into the sand or the pebbles on the beach and get it nicely secured so that when the waves come in and out, they're not going to move it around. So I actually push those tripod legs in, maybe about a half foot if I can, and get everything safe and secure. Let a few waves come in and out so that the sand or the pebbles settle in around the tripod. And that way, whenever the water pushes in or pushes out, it's not going to move the tripod around. Be very careful when you're doing this, because if you push too hard on your tripod, the legs will spread and you could break your tripod. So what I do is I don't have my legs spread out all the way. I actually have them in just a little bit. So instead of like putting the legs out at the full angle, I have them more like this. And then as I push the tripod down gently into the sand, the legs will naturally spread out to their maximum position, and I don't push any farther from that. So that's the way I push it in. Once again, always be very gentle, because you can actually break your tripod if you push down too hard. But once you get it in the sand and get it settled in, and maybe have a few inches of sand around the tripod feet, then when the waves come in and out, chances are your tripod's not going to move, and you'll get nice, sharp exposures during the long shutter speed that you have.
Can I interrupt for just a moment?
Of course you can.
We had two questions that have come in for tripods. One you've already answered, but just to reiterate, Natalie did ask earlier, do you use a tripod for all of your waterfall photography?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes,
if you're not using a tripod, you cannot get these long exposures. So imagine if you're just like hand holding your camera and you're trying to do a 1 second exposure. So my hands are pretty steady. I probably don't want to do any brain surgery, but even with my hands being as steady as they are moving a little bit. You can probably see that. So during 1 second, if you're hand holding your camera, there's going to be all this shake. And so you're going to end up with a blurry image. So you absolutely need to use a tripod whenever you're doing long exposures.
Okay, follow up. Jorge asked, do you have any particular recommendations for tripods that are good for the water? So we had the technique. Do you have a specific tripod in mind?
Not really. I mean, there's so many brands out there. They're all good. The key thing is to remember that salt water can be pretty bad for any tripod that you're using, so you want to rinse your tripod off with fresh water as soon as you're done. So if I'm working on the coast, when I'm done with my sunset shoot, I come back to my hotel room, or if you live on the coast, and I will actually walk into the shower. I'll obviously undress and get in the shower, but I'll bring my tripod in with me, and I will clean myself off, and I'll clean my tripod off at the same time. That was probably a little bit more personal than I needed to get, that I shower with my tripod.
That's what you come here for, all the little details.
It's crazy. It's not romantic. It's purely platonic. But yes, I do share the shower with my tripod. But the reason why I get in with the tripod is that way I can make sure to really rinse everything off. And if you've ever tried to clean off a tripod in a hotel shower while you're standing outside and you're trying to rinse off the legs and things like that, it's a messy affair. So I might as well. My view is just dive right in. You might as well get cleaned off anyways after your evening shoot. Another thing to consider is certain types of tripods are more likely to have problems locking up when you're shooting in the water, especially salt water, or if there's grit or dirt or sand in the water, even if it's fresh water. So anything with one of those rotating collar locks, those collars can get stuck. So those little knob lock tripods actually work pretty well in most environments. They're less likely to get stuck. And a lot of people, if they're doing a lot of work in saltwater environments, will shoot with wooden tripods, which are great because you never get those stuck. They're built differently than your typical aluminum or carbon fiber tripods. They're designed for use in wet environments. And they're very heavy and they're bulky, but they actually work great. So if you're planning on doing a lot of coastal shooting, you might want to consider getting a wooden tripod if you could still find them. I don't know if they make them anymore. So I have a wooden tripod. If anyone's looking to buy one, let me know because I never use it anymore. So
this has been our tripod detour.
Yes. Back to our photos. All right, so I thought I only sent 15 photos, but I think I had a bunch of photos that I'd collected that I was going to send for this live event, and then I deleted a bunch of them. At least I thought I deleted them. But I'm seeing a lot of photos that I remember deleting in the bunch, so I might have sent a little bit more than the 15 I thought I sent. So here is a shot from Zion National Park. This is the famous Virgin River, the Narrows of the Virgin River. And so the Narrows is a great hike. You have to actually walk in the water for miles and miles on end, and it's basically this giant slot canyon that you're walking through, so you get all this interesting glowing light in there in the middle of the day, and it's really a lot of fun. And the water is a critical aspect. So for this particular shot, I chose a foreground where the shape is created by that blurred water. So as the water is flowing over rapids, that's where you get that white water. And so anywhere where it's not flowing over rapids, there's no color or texture. The water is very dark. But those rapids creates that white water, and that white water creates a shape. So I was looking for that shape for this composition. And so for this particular shot, let's see, which color should we use this time? Let's use yellow. That white water created this triangle shape, or actually maybe more of a diamond shape, or two triangles, however you want to put it. But that shape gets the eye moving out left and right, and then back into the center of the composition. So that's why I selected this particular composition. And so once again, I did a long shutter speed to create enough white space to create that diamond or inverted triangle shape. And I think this was probably 4 or 5 seconds for this particular shot because the water wasn't moving very fast. It almost didn't matter. I wasn't really trying to retain too much texture in the water. I was more interested in creating that entire shape here. So that's what I was looking for here. So once again, there's no right or wrong way of doing this. The shutter speed that you choose, it will depend on how fast the water's moving and what you want to achieve as an artist when you're making your photograph. This shot I took off the coast of Belize, and I was photographing this deserted island, this small island 20 miles off the coast of Belize. There was no one around for 20 miles except for the guy I hired to take me out on a boat to get out there. And there was this really nice sunset happening behind the island, so I waded out into the water, into the coral reef that surrounded the island, and I was using some of those bits of coral sticking out of the water as my foreground elements. Let me just go into markup mode here. I think we're going to use yellow. So this creates a visual progression that sweeps the eye around from left to right. So what I wanted to do was to have a wave that would reinforce and complement that visual progression, that shape that's created. I also wanted to have a wave that would complement and mirror that curving shape of the sky. So I've got these clouds, these storm clouds that are lighting up at sunset, creating this curve. So I wanted to have a wave that would complement that shape and create a mirror image of that shape so that all these shapes would work together. Let me hold on a second. too much drawing. Let me get rid of all that. So all those shapes would work together to get the eye sort of spiraling within this composition to trap the eye. So once again, I started off with about a 1/2 second to 1 second exposure and experimented there. And I waited for waves to come in and probably took 30 or 40 shots. I just kept on shooting until I finally got a wave that came in that gave me the shapes that I wanted. And for this particular composition, the wave created all of these lines. So having that mix of texture and motion blur creates these shapes. So this creates a bunch of lines that lean in diagonally and converge into the center of the composition. So all of these shapes work together to keep the eye trapped within the composition. So this is always what I'm looking for when I'm making shots like this. So let's go on to the next image. Now, you can get a different look when you do a very long exposure, that silky smooth look that we talked about earlier. So this is a shot from the Olympic coast, and this was taken at twilight, and it was probably closer to 30 seconds, and there was a lot of waves coming in and out, but that longer exposure blurs that water coming in and out, so I lose a lot of that texture. And I'll do that. I'll sometimes blur the water out to get that silky smooth look if I want to enhance the reflection. So in this particular shot, that longer exposure smoothed out that detail in the water and allowed the reflection of the rocks and that colorful reflection from the sky above to be more apparent in the water. So sometimes you want to smooth things out and get rid of detail for that reason. Other times you just want to have that more creative, misty look to the water. So something like this might be 15 or 30 seconds. Here's the opposite. Here's an incoming wave. Actually, this is on the opposite side of the country. So the shot here was from the Pacific coast, and this is from the Atlantic coast, the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And I had a stunning sunrise sky. And so I chose a 1/2 second to 1 second exposure as the waves were coming in. And as the waves were coming towards me, they were creating all of these lines during the long exposure that I was able to use creatively for my composition. So here, for example, we have all these lines that are created. Once again, they end up being diagonal lines that all converge in the center of the composition. This gives this composition a lot of energy. Those lines complement the lines formed by the sun rays that are streaking through the clouds in the sky. So these shapes all working together. I'm always thinking about the shapes created by my background scenery, by the clouds that are in the sky, and how I can use my long exposures to create shapes in the moving water that will complement and work together with those other shapes in the composition. Oops, sorry, hold on 1 second. Okay. And here's another, we've got a lot of examples here. I'm going to kind of go through them quickly. Once again, this was, I've got my foreground, that boulder in the foreground, that's the visual anchor. I was waiting as the water was flowing past the boulder, and as it was going around, it was a lot of water, so it creates this lip, this ring around the water that I think was really interesting for this composition. And the water was moving in and out really fast, so during the 1 second exposure I used to create this shot, the outgoing wave hit the next wave that was coming in. So you can see that next wave coming in, hitting the rock and spraying up in the middle of the composition. Here I was in a stream below a waterfall, and there was a lot of foam in the water, and it was all moving towards me. So I used a wide-angle lens, and I got really low and close to the water. It was very still water, and it was moving very slowly. So I used a neutral density filter to lengthen my exposure time to 30 seconds, so that all of that foam that was moving slowly downstream in this shot creates these streaking lines. So, just once again, we'll go into the markup mode here, and you can see all of these lines that are created by the streaking foam during this long 30-second exposure. So here the water wasn't moving very fast. It didn't have a lot of texture to begin with. These bits of foam that were in the water were the most interesting thing, and I knew that during that very long exposure, they would travel throughout the entire composition and create these really powerful lines that would lead the viewer deeper into the composition. Okay, here's just another example. I didn't have any foreground. All I had was water I needed to have some sort of foreground element to lead the eye into the composition, so I waited for a wave to come in. Once again, experimenting with a half second, 1 second exposure, taking lots of shots as the waves come in and out, constantly experimenting until I get a shape that's interesting. Here we've got a curving shape that leads the eye to the sea stacks and the sunset sky in the background. Here, once again, not a lot of water going over the rocks in the Virgin River Narrows of Zion National Park. So I had a longer exposure, probably 8 seconds, to produce enough white to create some detail that would create some shapes that would help facilitate the viewer's progression from near to far in the composition.
No, you called that a slot canyon earlier before, right?
Yeah.
There's a question that came in about that from Jesse.
Okay.
Asking, have you ever shot moving water in a darker environment like a slot canyon? Looks like yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Without having the direct sunlight illuminating the scene, I'm wondering what kind of cool colors and looks you can achieve. So I was wondering if you might want to expound a little bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, one key element to all of these shots, you probably noticed, is there's no direct sunlight on any of it. When you get direct light on water, it can create a lot of exposure problems. You get all these bright hot spots. And also, when you've got really bright light, it's harder to get that long exposure effect. So a lot of times I'm shooting in overcast light for waterfalls, or when I'm on the coast, it'll be twilight, sunrise, and sunset. When there is less light and longer exposures are easier to achieve. If it's bright out, you might need like a polarizer filter or a neutral density filter. Both of these will cut down on the amount of light that's coming in, and that will help you get a longer exposure. When you're in a dark slot canyon, you're going to end up shooting very long exposures. As a matter of fact, a lot of times when I'm shooting in these dark environments, I'm moving my ISO up to make sure I don't have that super long shutter speed. I'll be setting my aperture at, let's say, f11 for depth of field, and if it's really dark, I might end up with a 30-second exposure at ISO 100. So I might jump up my ISO to like 400 or 800, so I avoid those super long exposures. And when you're working in something like a slot canyon, for example, you get a lot of reflected light that moves down, so you can get some really interesting colors and reflections there. And there are opportunities. Another thing I like to do when I'm shooting moving water, like a waterfall, is if you do have a little bit of light, let's say, for example, we're dealing with an autumn scene and there's some autumn foliage around the waterfall. If you do have some sunlight lighting up that foliage, you can get some interesting reflections of that color in the water. So there's a lot of different things you can do in different kinds of light. You just have to adjust your expectations to the scene and the light that you have. Okay? All right. And so going back to the photos, this is a shot from Zambia. This is Victoria Falls. This was actually a huge waterfall. So there was this very large volume of water that would normally necessitate a shorter shutter speed, but the waterfall was also kind of far away. And so I was able to get away with using a longer shutter speed. It really didn't matter. If it was 1 second or 30 seconds, it ended up looking pretty much the same with a big scene like this that's relatively far away. And here is Great Smoky Mountains, where you can see me looking for that visual anchor, that boulder sticking out of the water to make the near-far juxtaposition more compelling for the viewer. And this shot was chosen so that I would have all the white water flowing around that boulder, creating this line that leads the viewer from foreground to background. Here's a shot from the coast of Iceland, and this was a longer exposure, like maybe 1 minute or 2 minute exposure that I achieved with a neutral density filter. And you can see how all the water that comes in and out during that long exposure just accumulates and blurs. So all of these waves coming in were pretty big, but when you've got 20 or 30 waves during a single exposure, they all blend together, and that gives you more of this silky smooth or this misty look, which can be very evocative and very effective and very artistic. So I think we've pretty much gone through just about everything. And so those are all my tips, many of which were repeated, unfortunately, several times, because I think I accidentally sent in more photos than I intended. But I've given you a lot of different examples, and I think the key thing that unites all of these is that I was looking for a shutter speed that would give me that mix of texture and motion blur, so that the water would create interesting shapes that would facilitate the viewer's movement throughout the composition, that would lead from near to far, that would encourage the viewer to come deeper into the scene and hold their attention over the long time. That is the key thing for using moving water creatively with outdoor photography.
What a thesis statement.
Yes, thank you.
We have about 20 minutes left, so we're going to start to dig into the Q&A.
I'm going to get some water.
I was just going to say, we'll let Ian take a little slug of water. And a lot of these we did get a chance to get to kind of piecemeal throughout, so we're going to get through as many as possible. Let's go right back to the top of the chat here. Carlos has our first question. What is your take between DSLRs and mirrorless, and why?
Okay, well, so essentially a DSLR differs from a mirrorless camera because it has a mirror and a mirror box. So the old style cameras, you would look through a viewfinder, and the image you see when you're looking through the optical viewfinder is just a reflection of the image coming in through the lens. It hits a mirror and it bounces through this mirror box and goes to your eye. Now, a mirrorless camera eliminates that optical viewfinder and eliminates that mirror box, and instead gives you a live view digital projection. So you're looking at basically a video of whatever your camera sees, and a lot of these mirrorless cameras will have a digital viewfinder, so it's not an optical viewfinder. When you look through the viewfinder, you're seeing another one of these digital videos. And the advantage of these mirrorless cameras is that they're smaller and they're lighter than DSLRs. So a lot of people have been switching over to them. They don't really differ in terms of image quality. Like a lot of times camera manufacturers will put the same sensor in a DSLR and in the mirrorless cameras that they have. So the only real advantage is that you've got a lighter weight unit to use, and that can just make your life a little bit easier when you're walking around with lots of camera gear. So there's no real disadvantage to using mirrorless. There are a few specific disadvantages. So for example, a mirrorless camera might not be as good if you're doing like action photography, wildlife, or sports, just because there's a little bit of a lag when you're looking through the digital viewfinder. Sorry, my microphone is digging into my neck right now. I apologize. There we go. So there might be a little bit of a lag, a little bit of video drag. So what you see in the digital viewfinder or on your live screen view might be a little bit delayed compared to what you're seeing with your eye. And so if you're trying to photograph that critical moment, I think a DSLR is still better. And also with a lot of mirrorless cameras, because it's a smaller platform, the manufacturers try to take advantage and they make smaller lenses. So they make everything smaller, but there might be a few features that are no longer available to you on these smaller, reduced in size platforms. So for example, I see a lot of people who come on my landscape photography masterclass photo workshops with mirrorless cameras, and the lenses for a lot of these cameras don't have distance scales on them, so it's a lot harder for these folks to do things like focus stacking and stuff like that than it might be for folks like me who have got the older style cameras and lenses. And also, like the mirrorless cameras, because you have to rely on this digital live view all the time, they might not be as easy to use in real low light. Like I've done a lot of workshops where I might do some night photography with my workshop participants, and the people with the mirrorless cameras struggle the most because when it gets really dark, that digital live view just doesn't work anymore. And so they have a real tough time composing and focusing, whereas people who are using DSLRs with an optical viewfinder can still see the night scene as well as the eye can see it. So they might be able to more easily compose and focus their images. So, these few specific disadvantages in mind, there's no real disadvantage to using a mirrorless system. I'm still using a DSLR because I still do a fair amount of travel and wildlife photography, and I think that platform is better. But mirrorless systems are getting better and better, and I'm actually thinking about buying my first mirrorless system and thinking about making the switch myself. So we'll see.
All right. Let's zoom out a little bit with Quinn's question.
All right.
It's very general.
More water for my throat.
Quinn says, "Hi, Ian. What do you love to photograph? What is your specialty?"
I love to photograph anything. I used to be focused entirely on natural landscapes. Like I didn't want to have a person or any evidence of people in my shots. But I have become more of a generalist. I started shooting wildlife, I don't know, maybe 10, 12 years ago. And in more recent years, I've embraced other types of photography, including travel and street photography. I think at some point I realized that I was mostly interested in making compelling photographs. And if that happens to be of a natural landscape, so be it. But if I see a compelling moment emerge in it has people or animals or anything else going on, I'm going to photograph it. So I'm pretty much a jack of all trades. I just love it when beautiful composition, beautiful light comes together and forms a magical moment. And it doesn't matter to me who or what is in the scene at the time. If the moment is right, I'm going to take a photograph of it. Ask my cats at home. When I'm stuck in the home office, every now and then I'll see one of my cats in some beautiful light coming through the window, and I'll take a shot. And the cat thinks I'm crazy. If I show the photo to anyone else, everyone else thinks I'm crazy. But it still is good art, and even if it's of my cat, I'm going to take a picture of it.
Perfect. Let's move on to Grant's question. What are your go-to lenses for waterfalls?
So my go-to lenses for waterfalls, I think it's pretty easy. I'm a wide-angle guy, so almost always I'm shooting with a wide-angle zoom. And right now, the two wide-angle zooms that I'm using the most are my Canon 11-24 and my Tamron 15 to 30 millimeter lens. So those are the lenses that I use for probably 95% of my photography, including waterfalls. I like to go wide. You know, when you go wide when you're shooting waterfalls, you can include that interesting foreground. You can find that boulder with the water flowing around it, and that really makes for a more compelling, dynamic shot. Now, the trick with a wide-angle lens is you got to get close to that foreground element. You've got to make it big enough in your foreground so that it's prominent, so that it's going to be the first thing that the viewer looks at when they study your composition, and it's going to be the thing that they always come back to. If you're too far away, then that boulder in the water is going to look really tiny, and it's not going to be an effective part of your composition. So go wide and get close.
All right, let's move on to Lydia's question.
Hey, Lydia.
Lydia asks, is an ND filter or polarizer required for waterfall shots?
Okay, so I think ND filter and polarizer filters are actually very useful for water shots, though they're not always required. So the two filters are designed to do two different things, though they actually overlap a little bit as well. So a polarizer filter is designed to remove reflections and glare. And it can be really useful when you're photographing a waterfall because there's a lot of wet rocks and the water, of course, is wet. And so like if you're shooting a waterfall on a cloudy day, it's going to be reflecting that gray sky that's above you. And all that gray on the wet rocks and in the water can be very unattractive. So you use the polarizer to eliminate that reflection. This will enhance the contrast in your scene. It'll darken all those wet rocks so that you're not going to have a lot of really annoying hot spots in your shots. And overall, contrast and color will look a lot better. It's really great also with foliage, like spring, summer, and autumn foliage. Leaves are actually kind of waxy and they reflect a lot. So when you use a polarizer, it'll get rid of the reflection on the wax of the leaves. Also, if the leaves are wet, like if it's just rain, for example, the polarizer will get rid of the reflections and more of the native color of the leaf will come through. Now, a neutral density filter is just a gray filter that is designed to block light coming in to your lens. Now, a polarizer is also dark. It's also blocking some light, usually 2 stops of light. With a neutral density filter, you can pick different strengths. So some ND filters will block 1 stop, 2 stops, 3 stops, 5 stops, 10 stops, if you're really looking to do super long exposures. And you use these filters to control the amount of light coming in so you can choose the shutter speed that you want. So if you're shooting a waterfall on a relatively bright day, and you can't get that half-second exposure that you know is perfect to get the look you want, then you might need to use an ND filter to block some of that light coming in, to slow down your shutter speed, to get the exposure that you want.
All right, I'm actually going to piggyback a couple questions onto this while we're on the topic.
Okay.
Lori, Jeff, John S., they're all interested in this topic. Lori's asking, is it a problem to leave the polarizing filter on in low light conditions? Mm-hmm. Jeff is wondering what your method is to determine what level of the ND filter to use at any one time. And John S. is mixing it all together. Do you use the polarizing filter on top of the ND filter? Okay,
let's go through these separately. So the first question is it okay to leave the polarizer on in low light conditions? So, the polarizer is going to cut down on 2 stops of light coming in. So that's going to make, for example, a 1 second exposure 4 seconds long. So every time you lose a stop of light, you have to double your exposure to get the same exposure value. So when you put the polarizer on, if your exposure was 1 second to begin with, now you've got a 4 second exposure. So if you want to keep the shot at 1 second, that means you need to add more light either through ISO or opening up your aperture. So you have to add that extra light some other way. So, a lot of times when I'm shooting waterfalls, I'll put the polarizer on. I'll say, you know what, at ISO 100, I'm getting too long of an exposure, so I'm going to bump up the ISO to 200 or 400. And you can do that to a point. Obviously, when you start using those really high ISOs, you might be introducing a lot of digital noise into your photographs, reducing image quality, and if things are really dark, there's a limit to how much ISO you can add to it. So if things are too dark, you're getting exposures that are too long, that's when you might want to decide to take the polarizer off, even though it's going to mean that you have some extra glare and reflection in your scene. Now, a lot of times, I don't mind that glare and reflection. It really depends. Sometimes I actually think it looks better without the, with the glare and the reflection. Sometimes it looks better without it. So I might experiment with the polarizer and decide if I want to use it or not. A lot of times when I'm shooting colorful reflections, I want to keep those reflections, and the polarizer would remove those reflections. So that should answer the polarizer question. The next one was, how do you determine the strength of neutral density filter that you need? That depends on how bright it is, and that depends on what length of exposure that you want. So let's say when you set up your camera, you end up with a 1 second exposure, and you really want a 4 second exposure. You know that you need to reduce the exposure by 2 stops. You would take out a 2-stop ND filter to get that 4 second exposure. So simple as that. So if you want to have a 30 second exposure, so 1 second, you need to double that exposure several times. So we'll count it off. Each time you double your exposure, that's 1 stop. So 1 second to 2 seconds is 1 stop. 2 seconds to 4 seconds is 2 stops. 4 seconds to 8 seconds is 3 stops. 8 seconds, now typically you would just go up to 16, but we'll make it easier. We'll just round it down to 15 because no one wants to double 16. It's easier if you do 15. So 8 seconds, so 1 second to 2 seconds is 1 stop. 2 to 4 seconds is 2 stops. 4 to 8 is 3 stops. 8 to 15 seconds is 4 stops. 15 seconds to 30 seconds, you can see why doing 15 seconds instead of 16 seconds makes more sense, is 5 stops. So you need a 5-stop filter to get that exposure. If you wanted to go up to 1 minute, 30 seconds to 1 minute is 6 stops, and so on. So that's why you don't go to 16 seconds from 8, you go to 15 seconds, because then you can go to 30 seconds, then you can go to 1 minute, 2 minute, and so on. It's just easier that way.
Math.
Okay, yes, math. And the final question, if I remember correctly, is which do you put on first, the polarizer or the neutral density filter? It really doesn't matter. It depends on the type of filters that you're using. The polarizer needs to spin to achieve the polarization effect. So if you're using a bunch of screw-on filters, you're going to want to have the polarizer on the outside so you can spin it. But if you're using like a filter holder, it doesn't really matter because the whole filter holder will spin. And the ND filter, doesn't matter what position it's in. If it spins along with the polarizer in that filter holder, it doesn't matter. So.
All right.
But typically you would put the polarizer on the outside if you have screw-on filters. Now remember, if you're stacking a bunch of screw-on filters on a wide-angle lens, you're going to get some vignetting. Those filters are going to appear on the edges and corners of your image frame. So that's why people use a filter holder, which is designed to accommodate multiple filters at the same time. And they'll often have an adapter ring that's recessed. So when you put the ring on your lens and then you put the holder on the ring, the whole thing is pushed back so that you don't get that vignetting, you don't get those filters appearing on the sides and edges of your image frame. And my voice is beginning to stray into dangerous territory here. I'm beginning to sound like an 11-year-old boy. I'm going to try to rally and I'm deep in my voice so that I sound like Batman. We'll see if it works.
Well, we have 5 minutes left to test it out. I'll try to draw this next question out, even though it's rather short.
The water is cold, so when I drink it to soothe my throat, it freezes my vocal cords. So from now on, I want a control booth. I want tepid water from now on. Tepid.
All of my singer training is starting to threaten to come out. Ramon is asking our next question.
Hello, Ramon.
How do you prevent the white water from blowing out?
Okay, so a few things here. You want to choose your exposure very carefully because usually that white water is the brightest part of your scene. So you want to make sure that you don't overexpose your highlights. And that's achieved by just making sure that you don't get those blinkies when you have your exposure highlight warning turned on, or you don't have that spike on the right side of your histogram. So protect your highlights, and that means you might have to darken your overall exposure a little bit if those bright whites in the water are much brighter than the rest of the scene, but you can always pull up the shadow detail later when you're processing the image. And the other key thing is to select that shutter speed where you retain some texture. So the appearance of those whites, if you do a longer exposure, you're going to see more of that white. And so if you avoid those super long exposures, you're going to have more texture in the water, less white, and that's going to help improve the overall look of your moving water photographs.
Okay, quick comment.
Okay.
Maybe you can take another swig of water. We have a guest that just says, the way that Ian is sitting makes it look like that monkey has no nose.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, here, let me, okay, it's an orangutan, and yes, there we go.
Gained a nose.
I apologize, yes.
This is taking it back a little bit. You did mention some equipment earlier, but Dave is asking, what kind of equipment do you have to keep everything dry when trekking through water? Any particular waders, camera gear, waterproof underwear?
You know, so waterproof underwear sounds like a good idea, but if you really think it through, it's a really bad idea because the water can't get in, but the moisture also can't get out. So no, I do not wear water. Well, I mean, you know, sweat. I guess
Very good.
I guess they have a word for waterproof underwear. They're called Depends
Diapers?
undergarments. Yes, they're called diapers. So you could wear those, I guess, in theory. So it's better to have some sort of system for allowing you to get into the water and get wet without your clothes or your body getting wet, and that will keep you dry. So at the very least, I mean, you know, the poor man's waders are just taking off your shoes and socks, rolling up your pant legs and wading in the water. And that's something that I typically do. If the water's not too cold or too deep, it's okay. Sometimes people will use rubber wading boots that are maybe like this tall, and they work great until the water is too high, and then they do an absolutely atrocious job at keeping your feet wet because the water just spills over into it. So I prefer something that goes up higher. So chest waders, the kinds that you know, like fly fishermen use, fly fisher people use, because I'm assuming that women also fly fish now, so I don't know.
Maybe.
Fly fisher people. If you're into fly fishing, you can buy inexpensive waders that will go all the way up to your chest. And I think that's better. Like you can get waist-high waders. Once again, that limits how deep of water you can get into. And if you're like, let's say you're on the coast and there's a wave that comes in over your waist, suddenly you're drenched. So chest-high is much better. And that gives you more flexibility, and you're much less likely that something is going to spill over the top and get you all wet. So waders are great, and you know they're super cheap. You could just go into a fly fishing store and ask the salesperson to help you get a pair of waders, and you can get them as cheap as like $70 if you want. They're not that expensive at all. And you also want to get like a pair of wading boots that go with those, and they make these special boots for fly fisher people to use. And they will often have like rubber studs or felt on the bottom that gives you traction in slippery rocks in the water. So that can be really helpful as well. And sometimes they'll have like little metal studs that you can screw in, and that's useful as well. So I definitely recommend chest waders. That's probably the safest, warmest, driest way you can go. If you want to wear waterproof underwear underneath that, go for it. I'm not here to judge. So gear is another thing that you want to keep dry. And what I'll do if I know that I'm going to be spending a lot of time walking through water or getting into water, I will put my camera gear in a dry bag. So it's like a vinyl bag. You put the gear in, you roll the top of the bag down and clip it, and that seals it so that it'll protect your gear inside from water. Now, you want to make sure you've got it properly rolled and sealed. I have had a few times where I didn't seal my bag right, and I went swimming with the bag, and then I open it up and water pours out. All my equipment destroyed. That's a bad thing. So the easiest way to know that everything is sealed is as you roll it down and seal it. If there's still air trapped in it, then you're good to go. If you're pushing it down and all the air escapes, that means there's a hole or you haven't sealed it properly. So the best thing you can do is to double bag it if you're worried about it. So I'll take one dry bag, put my gear in it, and then I'll put that dry bag into a second dry bag just to make sure that nothing gets in and gets my gear wet.
Okay, I'm going to give you an option.
Or you could put the waterproof underwear around your camera and try that. So
Completely up to you.
great question, by the way. That definitely rocketed to the top of the question list. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. We have time For one more question.
One more question. Okay.
Well, we're on just a little bit over for it. Would you like me to mix 3 similar ones together again? Or,
go for it. Rapid fire.
All right, let's do, well, they're very similar. So
Okay.
we've got Mark.
Hello, Mark.
I know it might seem redundant, but do you ever find yourself having to use ND and GND filters, plus shooting HDR and photo stacking to get the results you want in camera? Or am I just trying to achieve the unattainable? Which should also answer Max K's question, which is just the second half. Do you ever take a series of photos at different exposures and combine them afterwards using high dynamic range software to get the blur? And that should also answer the question from a guest, is it possible to shoot moving water in HDR?
Yes, yes, and yes. Well, okay, so it is possible to shoot HDR with moving water. Most of the HDR programs will give you some options for blending the moving water. It's called de-ghosting in Adobe Lightroom, for example. They're merged to HDR. It is a little bit trickier when you have variation exposure to exposure with moving elements, but by and large, most of the HDR programs can achieve it, and it can be useful. Like sometimes when I'm shooting waterfalls, if I've got that bright white water and the rest of the scene is kind of darker, I might shoot multiple exposures to blend it together just to get more detail in the shadows without having any noise. So it's definitely a useful technique that you can use. And it can allow you to shoot waterfalls in mixed light. So if you've got a little bit of sunlight on that autumn foliage in the background, but the waterfall's in shadow, you can do that exposure blend. Now, if you really want to do exposure blending, exposure blending using a graduated neutral density filter, and focus stacking, there are some scenes that you could actually do all 4 of those at the same time. I don't think I've ever quite done that. Maybe I've done like the hat trick. I might have done 3 at the same time. I don't think I've ever done all 4 at the same time. But you know, one of these days you're going to see that Goldilocks scene that requires you to do all 4 at the same time, and you will be a moving water photography king or queen when you actually accomplish that. So I hope that answers your questions, the crazy ones and the non-crazy ones. And I hope that you have found this information and this session helpful. And I think that's it for now. So Leah, do you have any wrap-up announcements?
Just a reminder to follow us on social media. We've got Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and Twitter. Outdoor photography guide on all of those social media accounts will do you well.
There you have it. I think that's it for today. We'll see you the next time on OPG Live. I'm Ian Plant.
I'm Leah Zahner.
And goodbye for now. Bye.